Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teddy Talks, a podcast created by UCL Paediatric Society, where medicine meets mischief and we discuss all things pediatrics, from teddies to training pathways. I'm Yameena, one of your co-hosts, and I'm currently in my second year of medical school.
And I'm Laetisha, your other co-host, and I'm in my 5th year of medical school. And we're so excited to finally be able to launch this project and explore pediatrics together. We're bringing you along with us as we dip our toes into the vast array of subspecialties in pediatrics. If you're a medical student or anyone interested in pediatrics but don't know where to start, just like us, then you're in the right place.
So last episode, we were really lucky to have Dr. Dilini Rajpaksha on the show to discuss her life within palliative pediatrics, and we had some amazing conversations on communication, dealing with grief, and blame within the specialty, and shed some light on how a specialty that has often difficult connotations is so all-encompassing and integrated into all areas of our healthcare system.
Yes, but today we're going to be focusing on an equally broad field that is general pediatrics. We're delighted to have Dr. Keir Shiels on the show today. Dr. Keir Shiels is a full-time NHS general pediatrician, author, educator, and speaker based in London. Dr. Shiels studied natural sciences at Cambridge before returning to pursue medicine and has since built a career that blends clinical expertise with a passion for medical education and storytelling. His work spans caring for children with complex medical conditions, authoring textbooks and articles, and speaking widely on medicine, communication, and the human side of healthcare. Known for his ability to make complex ideas accessible and compelling, Dr. Shiels brings both insight and charisma to conversations about children's health, medical practice, and the challenges facing the NHS today. So, Dr. Shiels, welcome to the show.
Wow, that is literally the kindest introduction that I think I have ever had. I need a transcript of that to put in my appraisal. Frankly, it could be my obituary. I'd be very, very happy with that. That's amazing. Thank you so much.
We'll absolutely get that email to you afterwards after recording.
Wonderful.
But yeah, thank you so much for being here. To start us off, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what a week might look like in general pediatrics. I think it is a bit of an impossible question, but just kind of tell us what that's like and what kind of patients you see.
Yeah, okay. Is there such a thing even as a normal thing in general pediatrics? I might have to do that sort of classic university thing of not answering the question, but just analysing why the question needs to be unpicked and rewritten.
Mm-hmm.
No, I will try to answer it properly. So the weird thing, first of all, about where I work, Great Ormond Street, is that there's no maternity unit and there's no A&E because we are a referral hospital. And I think most general paediatricians' working week sort of revolves either around the maternity unit or A&E in one way or another, because we're generally responsible for the children who get admitted in acute medical problems that can't be just dealt with quickly and sent home by A&E or can't be just sort of dealt with by the midwifery teams. So we get a lot of very varied presentations coming through acutely. In Great Ormond Street, it's a little bit different because everybody's seen their paediatrician in A&E or clinic or whatever and is being referred in for specialist treatment. And I guess the other thing that general paediatricians do, the bread and butter of my work, is that we provide all of the medical care for the really complex children who are undergoing speciality input, because with the best will in the world and kindness to my speciality colleagues, the last person you probably want managing your child's complex epilepsy, diabetes and asthma is their ophthalmologist. So we let the ophthalmologists sort of get on with their eye surgery, doing what they do best, and then we look after the rest of the child. So perioperative medicine in complex patients is one of the things we do. And there's an awful lot of child safeguarding stuff, trying to unpick whether injuries are accidental or inflicted, whether the malnourished child has got something wrong with their immune system or their enteral system, whether they've got celiac disease or whether they're actually the victims of neglect. So there are the great thing about pediatrics is that, you know, you can move from talking to a teenager with leukemia and then the next patient is a 3-day-old baby that's not feeding, and then the next patient after that is a 10-year-old with an acute mental health crisis, and then the patient after that is somebody with infected eczema. And so it's a really, really broad specialty, which is why there's no such thing as a normal week. But it's a brilliant, really diverse, wide specialty, and I love it.
Yes, sounds like a very varied week. Sounds like a very exciting week every day. You wake up, you don't even know what you're going to get. Can I just ask a little bit of a follow-up? You said that you also meet lots of children with quite complex cases. What did you mean by that?
So roughly 1%, I think it is, of children out there in the world, certainly in the country, have got significantly complex needs. So either they are very disabled from congenital problems, prematurity, birth asphyxia, and therefore have maybe cerebral palsy and epilepsy and a variety of disabilities and medical conditions that all add up on top of each other and interact with each other and are so medically complex, or children who have rare diseases, rare genetic diseases that are multi-system. So that's about 1% of all children. But that represents about 30 to 40% of medical presentations to A&E that get admitted. So you're looking at because, relatively well teenagers don't tend to go to hospital unless they've had injuries, an accident. So we see more than our fair share of medical complexity. And medical complexity is really children who are under multiple medical specialists at the same time. One of the jobs of a general paediatrician or a community paediatrician is to act as a sort of overseer, somebody who's making sure that those specialists are either talking to each other or thinking about each other, because we've all been in that situation where the cardiologists have started some diuretics and then 6 hours later the renal team stop the diuretics, and then 6 hours later the cardiologists start the diuretics, and then the renal team stop the diuretics, and you sort of wish that they would talk to each other and work out what the plan would be rather than just correcting each other's homework. So one of the things that we do is we try to pull our various teams together to talk to each other about these complex patients and facilitate professionals meetings and multidisciplinary thinking to try and get really complex children sort of on one single management.
Okay. Thank you for that lovely description of what general pediatrics is. I think it's quite clear to all of us now. Well,
it's a lot easier for me to describe than any other area of medicine. I wouldn't thank me too much for it, but very, very varied and great fun.
Yeah. So as mentioned earlier, your journey to medicine was through the graduate entry pathway and was following taking a natural sciences degree where you specialized in experimental psychology. So we wanted to know what made you decide to make that switch to medicine, and how has this background affected your view on pediatrics?
Yeah, so my entry into medicine was quite unusual. I started off at the age of 16, 17 doing A-levels and writing UCAS statements, absolutely adamant that I wasn't going to go into medicine. Medicine was the sort of boring choice that people who didn't think made when they were sort of vaguely good at sciences and had some interpersonal skills. And usually they would have a member of their family who was a doctor who could get them some easy work experience. And this was sort of passed on as some sort of weird hereditary autosomal dominant thing that if you had one parent who was a doctor, you sort of end up going into medicine yourself, which is not necessarily something that happens in, accountancy or or what have you. But no, I didn't want to do medicine. I wanted to be an actor. I'd done an awful lot of acting at school, National Youth Theatre, Royal Shakespeare Company at one point, English Shakespeare. I played Romeo. Then I went to university and spent more time really in the student theatre than I did in the lecture hall. And I did Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream and various other bits and bobs. And so I left university with a degree in experimental psychology, having really enjoyed it. I really got into neuroscience and psychology, and I loved learning about abnormal psychology in particular and neuropsychology. I had a particular interest in synesthesia and in autism spectrum disorders. I was fascinated, possibly because of all of the acting, by people who see the world very differently from me, and trying to put myself in the shoes of those people, and really trying to imagine what it was like not to be able to remember faces, or not being able to see movements, or not being able to empathise and understand facial expression. I found that fascinating. But I left wanting to be an actor, and within about 6 months, and having an agent lined up, I had really panicked about where the next paycheck was coming from, about how I would afford the council tax. And this was before I'd even applied to be an actor, you know what I mean? Before I got an agent and before I'd sort of done anything. So I realised that that was going to be my future. And I was at university with all of these people who thought they were going to be incredibly rich and famous actors who nobody's ever heard of now. You know, Eddie Redmayne and Rebecca Hall and Dan Stevens, and what have they ever done? So I gave up before I started. And I sort of looked around and was like, what on earth am I going to do? So I used my degree, I used my safety net, and I got a research job at the rather amusingly named Cambridge Centre for Brain Repair, which sounds like a quick fit garage for people with neurological disorders. And I really, really didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy research. I was trapped in a basement, filling out lots of forms and working in an incredibly slow-paced environment. And I'm a very impatient and impetuous person. But I enjoyed half a day a week. Which was when I got to go into a neurology research clinic and actually hang out with patients and do various bits of neuropsychological testing. So we would test sort of pattern recognition, memory, and so forth in patients with Huntington's and Parkinson's. And I just thought, you know, I can't live on 4.5 days a week of boredom. I want to do this half day a week forever. And that was the flashpoint. That was the epiphany. So I jacked it all in and went back to university to study medicine. And I haven't looked back. It was completely the right thing. I guess the final thing that I would say is that I'm really glad I did it the graduate way, because I don't think I was emotionally intelligent enough at the age of 18 really take studying medicine seriously. I would have done what I did with my first degree. I would have spent a lot of time in the student theatre. I would have scraped through exams. I would not have been as conscientious as I was doing it as a graduate, where suddenly you're paying a lot more for it, and you know, you're losing out on having a career for 4 years, which your friends are merrily in. So I knuckled down more then. I think it was the right thing to do for me, and I think it's probably the right thing for a lot more people to do as well.
Oh, it's a beautiful kind of reflection we've had. I think what was really interesting from the last few kind of trends we've spoken about is how, I think what's really interesting is, firstly, you're a generalist in a specialist hospital. I just think that's a really interesting kind of thing, because I think the same thing resonated in your response to that question about how broad one's interests can remain whilst in medicine. I think that a lot of us have this kind of instinct to sort of make medicine the kind of center of our universe, in a sense.
Oh, for God's sake, no! Don't! If all you've got is your job, you're nobody.
Exactly.
Oh, can you imagine? Can you imagine if that was all you had?
Exactly. And I think it is a really easy, what's the word, hole to fall down.
Yeah.
Especially with how,
I see students falling down that hole all the time. The question that I am asked more than anything about by students is like, here's a list of all of my accomplishments. What's missing? What more do I need to do? And I'm like, you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking, what have I done too much of? And what do I need to stop doing? Because only when you actually stop doing all of the unnecessary stuff do you then have time to concentrate on interesting things.
Absolutely.
Stop fretting about whether you've got like 2 papers or 4 papers or 8 papers. Just like, be happy with the research project, move on.
Absolutely. I think completely agree. I think sometimes in the haze of it all, it is those interests and our relationships with our friends, our hobbies, our interests. Those are the things that we instinctively drop first when things get hard. And we're absolutely going to be talking about kind of the idea of medicine as an art and life outside medicine a bit later on. But I just thought that those are some really important kind of notes to start on. But now a bit of a tangent now from where we just were. But last academic year, you ran a workshop for the London Medical School's paediatric conference on the topic of neurodivergence, and it's a major topic in developmental pediatrics. My goodness. And people hear a lot about autism and ADHD, but I think that the concept of neurodiversity isn't as widely understood as it probably should be. So we were wondering if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about what being neurodivergent is like from the patient perspective.
Yeah, I've always got to be quite cautious when talking about this, because obviously I'm viewing neurodivergence and neurodiversity sort of from the outside, and I'm not articulating a lived experience. So I've got to put that caveat in that I'm not neurodivergent myself, and therefore anything I say will be based on my impressions and my understanding, and there will be people listening to this who have an underlying autism spectrum disorder, for example, who then start going, no, that's not what it's like. And so I'm sorry, first of all. But I guess the important thing to understand is that we all have a variety of different ingrained personalities. And if you are an incredibly shy and retiring and introverted 11, it's highly likely that you're also going to be a relatively shy, relatively retiring, relatively introverted 25-year-old. There aren't many people who make a drastic shift of personality type. And so if you look just outside the bell curve of standard ranges of personalities and approaches to things, you start to find people whose experiences and personalities differ significantly from the established or generally understood norm, who also need more understanding from us so that we can understand how they interpret the world and how they interact with us, and what we do that they don't understand and what they do that we don't understand. And it's just a sort of culture thing, really, of trying to understand people who process and experience the world differently. So when I walk down the street, I don't get overwhelmed by, for example, a roadworks going on loudly in the street. That doesn't interfere with my ability to process life that's going on around me or stop thinking about the shopping or work or whatever. And there are some people who have exquisite sensory sensitivities. There are people with synesthesia who will suddenly get sort of blue jaggedy lines coming across their vision, and there'll be people with autism who get really disconcerted by surprising things happening. So really, neurodivergence is a spectrum away from a culturally established norm. But just because you have a culturally established norm doesn't mean that people outside that norm can't be understood. The example that I sort of try to give without appearing culturally insensitive is I remember the first ever time that I met a first generation immigrant from the Indian subcontinent as opposed to second, third, fourth generation person. And I was struck by the differences that there were in basic facial expression communication. The idea that the position of the eyebrows when tilting the head was actually aiming to converse something with me that I didn't know how to interpret. It was just a way of expressing that I'd not been exposed to before. And people from sort of my area of the UK, if we bob our head from side to side, we're sort of going, I'm being impatient, get on with it. Whereas this person was meaning, I'm listening to you, please continue. And, you know, that when you sort of feel that an awful lot of non-verbal communication is just sort of ingrained in us and that we understand social rules, suddenly you come across somebody who's got slightly different social rules and you're thrown a bit of a curveball. And that doesn't just happen in neurodivergence. It happens across all sorts of different cultures and all sorts of different groups. But working with people who are neurodivergent is really interesting because it's like having to work out exactly the clearest way to communicate information, and having to really listen to the way people are trying to communicate so that you can interpret what they're saying accurately. And that's the beauty of the challenge of it in medicine. But that's why I sort of became academically quite interested in it, as well as sort of professionally. I'm not sure that answers your question. It was sort of a ramble about the topic, but I hope that sort of got a few ideas out.
Yeah, no, I think you put it out really beautifully, like to think about autism as a difference rather than a disability, and to think about it as kind of like a difference in culture and how to process different information that we normally see in the world, which is something I feel like isn't a concept that is well known as it probably should be.
I agree. Yeah.
And you touched on a thing. It reminded me of how in medical school we've been told and we've been introduced to this idea that people with autism are kind of like being disabled by the environment, and they are not.
Oh, that's a good way of looking at it. Being disabled by the environment. That's a really nice prism to look at.
Yeah, it really stuck with me when they first said it to us. And like they said that like the environment we live in has been designed for neurotypical people, which can be more difficult to navigate for neurodivergent people. In relation to this, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what adjustments you normally kind of advise to parents or carers or anyone who wants to interact and help adapt the home or the environment surrounding the child to help with their development.
I think that's a really, really difficult question to answer, because you've used the word normally, and if I'm going to pick apart a question, the advice you've got to give is bespoke. Rather than sort of across the board. So it's really hard for me to work out sort of advice that I would give across the board. I think that the first piece of advice across the board is generally to understand that a child with an autism spectrum disorder particularly has got a different communication strategy, and that there may be other ways from the traditional of trying to understand them well. Now, that will then lay out a variety of different strategies that will be bespoke for each particular child. But trying to move away from inflicting, for want of a better phrase, your communication style on your child, but trying to find different ways of listening to your child. So there are some children, for example, who are non-verbal, who've got very good use of gadgets that give them a voice. You know, I have had one non-verbal child recently who was in bed with an iPad, who has never spoken a word in his life and does not interact very much in standard communication strategies, and his enjoyment of life is mainly around throwing objects and stacking objects. It's not sort of obsessing about videos and texts and things as we might think. He got Google Maps out, found the hospital, went on to Street View, walked on Street View around to a local park, and then literally handed the iPad to you. And you're like, oh, so you want to go to the park then? I mean, like, there are some amazing acts that you can be quite surprised by of communication. And that's no different to growing up with a child who's deaf. You know, shouting at your child if they're deaf is not going to help. You've got to learn sign language.
Yeah.
So similarly, if you have a child whose communication style is very different, you've got to know how to listen to them. And then I guess the second piece of advice is about how to teach other members of the family or people that they're going out with, again, how to listen and what to expect. I think as a society, we're becoming a bit better at, seeing people with big headphones over their head drowning out noise, for example. And I've seen some children with T-shirts on that say, I'm not being naughty, I'm autistic, or what have you, that are very good. I think society is a lot more understanding now than it was, say, 20 years ago. And part of the reason for that is that we've got so many public advocates now for autism spectrum disorders. So you look at somebody like, I don't know, the comedian Fern Brady, who's written a brilliant book about how being relatively high functioning but having autism completely affected her life choices as a teenager and young adult, and the problems that she fell into, but how the diagnosis really helped her understand herself as well as other people understand her. Now, 20 years ago when I was at medical school, 25 years ago when I was studying psychology, if you told me that there was such a thing as an autistic stand-up comic, a lot of psychologists would have said that's not possible, because you're supposed to have an understanding of rapport and the beat and timbre of language and empathy and situational awareness. Actually, a comedian like Joe Wells will say, well, actually I have a one-way conversation about topics that I'm really interested in, and I am able to create a conversation that has a pattern, and I get feedback that is non-verbal when something's hit right, and I can hone it. And so we've learned an awful lot about autism in the last 25 years, and about how broadly we have to think about complex concepts like empathizing and systemizing and so forth, which are oversimplifications of what an autism spectrum disorder is.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. Yeah, every single child. I mean, as we said before, like with autism, it is in a spectrum, and everyone does have like different ways of perceiving the world. That means also different ways of communicating, and I think that's quite good advice to like. Basically, the first thing that we really need to do is just understand how the child themselves communicate.
Yeah, I think the best advice that anybody gets is first shut up and listen. Like that's what you do in medicine, right? Right. The first thing that you learn in communication skills is like you say, "So what? Why are you here?" or something open-ended, and then you shut up and listen. What you don't do is interrupt the patient after like halfway through their first sentence to clarify what they're saying, and you don't banter. You don't behave like you do in a pub. You shut up and listen.
That is true.
And I think that's what you have to do in these really challenging situations. Is you just need to take a step back and kind of go, right, I'm gonna shut up and listen. I'm going to try and work out what somebody is actually trying to tell me.
Yeah. So the next question is a little bit more personal to me. I volunteer for a charity called Spectrum, and it provides a befriending service for neurodivergent children and children with disabilities. And one of the things that I have noticed is, I completely agree with you. Every single child that I've ever encountered in that charity do have different communicating methods and styles, and it's not very uniform at all. So by the time that this episode is released, the new cohort of volunteers would have been introduced into the charity, and I was just wondering if you could tell us if you have any tips for anyone who's hoping to work with children, really, or anyone at all, how we could communicate and quickly build a rapport with any child, and what additional considerations would you have for children with
This is a really, really good question, and like I could do an hour's lecture on this and still not I guess the single piece of advice that I would give about working with children, whether neurodiverse or neurotypical or whatever, is be interested in what they're interested in. So, like, if I sat you next to some, I don't know, forensic scientist who'd worked in the killing fields of the former Yugoslavia during the Bosnian War, right, over dinner, you'd go, that's an interesting person. I don't know anything about their life or anything, but I'm going to ask them questions. I'm going to be interested because they've probably had an interesting life, and that's really cool, right? And it's weird how as grown-ups we don't treat children generally the same way as we treat interesting adults. But the rule still applies, right? If they're obsessed by Paw Patrol, right, learn about Paw Patrol from them, learn who the characters are, colour stuff in with them, find out who Rocket is, find out who Chase is, work out which one's their favourite, ask if they've got
Yeah.
favourite episodes, learn from them just as you would an adult. And if
Yeah.
you've got an autistic child whose principal interest is stacking cups or throwing balls or whatever, don't play with them until you're bored.
Yeah.
Play with them until they're bored.
Yeah.
That's the nature particularly of charity work and body work, right? It's all about them. Okay. Now, if you're a parent, obviously you can't spend 5 hours throwing the same ball, because at some point you're going to have to do the laundry, right? There are limits that have to be placed in real life. But when you're doing something like you're doing, whether you're if you're providing a buddy service, even if you're doing that to provide respite for parents rather than buddying for the child, find out what they're interested in and be interested in it. Yeah. Just as if your boyfriend or girlfriend was like writing a thesis on Hamlet, you'd probably have to like go, oh, that's the one the Lion King's based on, and then sort of try to get into it in order that you can have a conversation with them over dinner.
Yeah.
Do that with kids, and just be inquisitive. And you may find a whole set of YouTube videos about clearing drains that you didn't know existed, but that actually suddenly makes you go, oh wow, that's weird technology. The bit like threading catheters through arteries. That's quite weirdly similar to what I want to do in the future or whatever.
Yeah.
So just be interested and make their interest infectious.
That's really good advice. I'm definitely bringing that to the training session next week.
So much adult-child interaction is like adult imparting wisdom to child, right? It's teaching, it's parenting, it's doctoring. There's that sort of direction of travel of information in one direction. People are always happiest when talking about stuff that they like. Yeah. People are always less happy about taking a lesson from someone else. So just flip it round.
Yeah.
Just flip it round and treat a child like a human.
Yeah, I think so. We had a really interesting conversation in our last episode about this as well. And so Dr. Rajpaksa, she works in like palliative peds, and she was talking about like instances where she'd learned something from her patients as well. And I mean, so much like on my first year of medicine, like our clinical kind of discussions, we always talk about how there is initially this expectation of that power imbalance when a patient walks into a clinic for a consultation. There is this kind of predetermined power balance, but how are we going to redefine that? And I think that's predominantly expected when it comes to children. But I think similarly in pediatrics, we're in such an amazing position where fun is expected and is a kind of part of our day to day. And
adult medicine could learn a lot from that. Adult
Absolutely,
medicine could learn an awful lot from that, because my job is not actually just to hopefully cure some kids. There are some kids who've got problems that are not going to be cured. But if I go in thinking like Patch Adams and think actually my job is to make kids feel better, then you can only succeed, right?
Exactly.
If you're trying to make them feel better. Now, we don't do that with adults. I mean, you go into a paediatric ward, whether it's a small district general hospital or whether it's a large specialist centre, they're colourful, they've got play therapists, they've got school, they've got things to occupy them, they've got games, they've got puzzles, they've got colouring, they've got stickers, they've got badges, they've got stuff in the waiting room. And how do we treat our adult patients? We've been to an adult ward recently. It's beige. The walls are beige. The staff are beige. Like everything is colourless. And then we say you can only have family to visit for an hour and a half, as opposed to have your friends or family around whenever you like. We don't provide them with entertainment. We don't provide them with anything cognitively stimulating. So you're bored, you're sick, you understimulated, and you fester. And this is unfair. And a play therapist can get a 3-year-old through an MRI scanner, for 25 minutes. Why do we not have the equivalent of play therapists for people with dementia? Why do we not have play therapists for people who are sort of physically impaired and can't just sort of get up and walk around. Yes, we can get people to the toilet, but can we get people just outside the hospital? Can we get them to a park? You know, it's lovely having the therapy dog around once a fortnight, but what are we doing to make people feel better? And we do that in paediatrics a lot. And I think that's the single thing that I wish adult medicine could learn from paediatrics, which is that we try to keep the little ones occupied.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm actually turning 20 next week, so I'm in that kind of weird
Oh,
phase
you're
where I'm
practically
like,
collecting your pension. My God, 20? I remember being 20. That's more than half my life ago. Wow.
so I'm in that weird phase where I'm like, I'm very much early into kind of my adult life, and you have that kind of, I think I'm a very sentimental person, so there's that kind of, mourning for childhood. But I thought that, I'd be a lot more emotional around this time if you had asked me a few years ago. But I think that one thing I've learned through my work through Pediatric Society and beyond is that yes, we grow up, but that child is still within you. Just because that the clock strikes 12 and you're 18 or you're 20 or whatever, that child just doesn't disappear at that time. So I completely
It
agree
never
with what you've
does.
just
It
spoken
never
about.
does.
Yeah.
I still define my hobbies as things that I haven't even done for like 15 years.
Yeah.
Because my adolescence and my early adulthood remain who I define myself as. And I can still remember, like, I can probably name, and I won't do it on the podcast because it'd be very boring to listen to. I could probably still name every episode of Thunderbirds that I watched when I was 8. I could probably talk for a minute without hesitation, repetition, or deviation on like the Ghostbusters cartoons or stuff that I enjoyed from my childhood. I could probably list the Blue Peter presenters of the late 80s and early 90s in chronological order. You know, that's who we are, and these are formative experiences. But I was lucky, like I assume you were, to have a childhood where this was not interrupted weekly or fortnightly with admissions to hospital. You know, we've got to realise that every time a child with cystic fibrosis comes into hospital, we are impeding them from having those sorts of childhood experiences that you look back on with that slight wistfulness. It was interesting that you talked about the pain of looking back on childhood. The pain of looking back is nostalgia, and it ends ALGIA because, like arthralgia and neuralgia, it is painful. Right? Nostalgia is a painful experience.
That connection at all.
Yeah. So yeah, we've got to realise that, you know, we are probably at our happiest when we are most carefree, and that naturally is when we are children.
Absolutely. And I think the next question is more topical. I think now that we're kind of speaking about emotion, it's an important one to speak about, particularly, especially because we've spoken about kind of neurodivergence, life, and about, again, that really incredible concept of being disabled by the environment.
Yeah, I didn't bring that to the conversation, you realise.
But we've had some really productive conversations so far. Just some highlights there. I think there is a known link between neurodivergence, neurodiversity, and mental health concerns. So, considering the challenges that neurodivergent children face in their immediate environment, potentially at school, meeting new people, kind of unfamiliar interactions, people who aren't aware of the concept of neurodivergence and their way of communicating, for example, it's not uncommon to find higher rates of anxiety, depression, and social isolation. So how do you, as a pediatrician, help support the mental health of neurodivergent children and just children in general?
This is really hard because, being brutally honest, there ends up being a line where you sort of want to help, but you can't easily cross it because it starts to become other people's responsibility. But equally, you want to sort of help as much as you can. So I've got a lot of children who are sort of 9 or 10 in my complex care clinic or my Noonan syndrome clinic. There's a sort of 60% prevalence of neurodiversity within the Noonan syndrome population, for example. Now, I can see coming down the tracks the fact that they're going to move from junior school to secondary school, and that's not just going to be a move away from like their current teacher, which has been the disruptive thing that they've had through primary school, but it's going to be a different building. It's going to be a completely different way of learning, having multiple teachers for multiple subjects. The chaos and noise that happens between classes moving around, learning the geography of a whole building, possibly being removed from half or most of the people in your current class, certainly being segregated on the base of academic ability into different sets so that you're not even with the same people for different topics. It's a massive thing. Now, obviously, as a doctor who looks after these patients, I want to help them with that transition as much as possible. But the challenge is that I can't do that for every single child that I've got, because they are all at different schools, they've all got different needs, and it's probably a full-time job to be a special educational needs coordinator in the run-up to a transition of school. So you have to start forming relationships and dialogues with people who are better qualified to deal with the problem, or just geographically better sited to deal with the problem. People who are on site. And so a lot of the stuff that I do around that sort of thing is not actually preparing the child, because I've got 20 minutes with them, half an hour if I'm lucky, an hour if I'm overrunning. And there's not much that you can do in that sort of hour every 6 months. So you have to start finding ways to create meetings. And I've got an amazing specialist nurse called Cecily, who used to work in the school sector as a special educational needs school, and is a clinical nurse specialist in complex paediatrics. And between us, we try to get in touch with the special educational needs coordinators of schools to help them understand this particular child in the context of stuff that they know about. And the further up the tree you get, less you end up taking direct responsibility for what's in front of you, and you start taking more of a leadership role and an oversight role in wrangling other people. And it's not really about delegation or laziness. It's literally about trying to manage the patient with the resources you've got. So when you're the F1 on the ward, someone's got to put the catheter in, you put the catheter in, and if you can't put the catheter in, you ask somebody else who's more experienced to do it. Once you're at that consultant level, you can kind of see some of the problems coming down the line, and you end up having to forge relationships and ask other people to take on some of those responsibilities. And likewise, they do that with me. So the school teacher should be getting in touch with our specialist nurse or me to say, we've got this problem brewing with attendance because of problems XYZ. Is there anything that's going on medically that you need to have a look at? It's about forging relationships actually around the patient, not just with the patient itself. That's not probably the answer you were expecting, because you were probably wanting more exam question A, B, C, D, E, which one of these do you do with the patient sort of thing. But actually there's a lot going in the orbit of the patient that you also need to deal with.
Absolutely.
I think you've highlighted really well that just how complex these patients can be, like all of your patients that you see, and it's not something that you can just take on all of the responsibility of. And you've just really highlighted, again, I think circling back to how you were saying, one of your biggest roles is also to facilitate this collaboration between teams, and that's so important.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest lessons that you end up having to learn, and you never really get taught it, you get told it, but you don't get taught it, is that you can't do everything yourself. And the problem with the sort of people who get into medical school are generally, they're the sort of people who like played first clarinet in a jazz band and also were on the rugby team and also were the captain of debating and also were in 5 school plays a week. And then they went to university and then they found stuff a bit hard because they had to do like at least an hour's worth of work a week instead of just winging it based on what they could do. And then, you know, they have a little bit of a hiccup at medical school, having sort of failed one exam that you can resit without any consequence. And then they get into the world of work for the first time, and suddenly they've got all of these tasks to do where people expect them to be sort of on it from an organizational point of view. And you know, the level of expectation on you just to cope and do everything just continues, and eventually you have to learn that you can't do everything and you need to ask for help. And everybody says it, oh, if you need to ask for help, just ask for help. But nobody really drives into you the importance of asking for assistance early, not just asking for help when you don't know what to do or when you're completely swamped, but seeing stuff coming down the line. And gradually, once you're a consultant, you ask for help from anybody. Like, you've got permission just to ring a random renal consultant and go, look, sorry to bother you, mate, but I can't remember how the kidney works. No one can remember how the kidney works. It's mad. It's small, it's brown, and if you roll the nephrons out over a tennis court, you die. That's what I can remember about the kidney. So you gradually move through training into becoming much, much more collaborative. And I got a really good lesson about this, because I was the sort of person, as you can probably imagine, as like an SHO or like an ST, who would like be given a whole load of jobs to do at the start of the day, and I'd go off and I'd do them, and then I'd come back once they were all done, and once I'd sorted everything out, and I'd come back at handover and I'd gone, I've done the work. And I thought that was probably the best way of going through medicine. Right, was just to like get the work, do it well, and you know, be relatively competent at it. And then suddenly I became a senior registrar, and I had 2 SHOs under me, one of whom kept coming back to me every 40 minutes just to clarify something, or just to say that they'd done this, but they'd found XYZ and they'd done that as well. Was that all right? And one who did the work and came back at handover. And I'll tell you which one I trusted. I trusted the one who came back every 40 minutes to tell me what was going on. Yeah. I had no idea where the other guy was or what they were doing. Yeah. And I would be like, I haven't heard from them for 2.5 hours. I better go and check up. And like, everything was sorted. Everything was fine. But you realise that the way that you try to impress people through diligence and competence isn't necessarily the way that information is received. And this goes all the way back to like what it's like to be autistic or neurodivergent. That the way you are expressing yourself isn't necessarily the optimal for the way that information is received. And I suddenly realised when I was a senior registrar what a shit SHO I'd been, because I thought I was gloriously competent and incredibly talented. And actually I had created this atmosphere behind me of people not knowing where I was or not knowing what was going on, and actually being humble and coming back to your senior every now and again and going, just as an update, this is where we are. I've found this thing and I've done that thing. Is that all right? Rather than just finding the thing and doing the thing and sort of, because the expression for that is going rogue. It's like being a maverick. Now, those are not qualities one looks for in a doctor, but being independent and going rogue have got a very fine line between them. And so my advice is, don't take everything on. Be as collaborative as you can. Obviously, don't come back to your senior with every single piece of information, because then you'll look like you're falling apart and not coping. But bear in mind that you should not be doing everything, and you should be collaborative as well as resourceful.
Thank you so much for that advice. I think we've had a lot of good conversation, productive conversation, as Yameena put it, about neurodivergence, and even lots of good tips about how to interact, how to communicate, and things like that. So thank you so much about that. For the next question, I just wanted to take a step back again and talk about childhood development in general. So as medical students, we hear a lot about the role of social determinants of health, which include a person's environmental conditions, economic status, housing, and so on. So We were wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on how these factors are relevant to childhood development, and how do you, as a general pediatrician, involve this in your practice?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the world and society is really unfair, and it gives people advantages and it gives people disadvantages, and you have to sort of play the hand that you're dealt in life and try to improve it as best you can. But there are multiple social determinants of health, and it is undeniable that if you've got only one parent who also has a drug problem, and you're living in a damp single room in a building that's also used as a brothel, and there's violence outside your door, you're not going to have the same advantages in life as somebody who's been brought up on a country estate with servants and a gardener. You know, I mean, it's just like we live in a society where the poorest and most disadvantaged and the wealthiest are living unrecognisable lives compared with each other. And then you spread that out across the world rather than just across the country, and the disparity is even. Childhood development is the serial acquisition of skills through life. And in terms of the impact on childhood development, you know, it matters how much social interaction and parenting you have physically as to how quickly and how technically well you adopt those skills, and how quickly and adeptly, if anything goes wrong, things are put right. That's the basics. So if you are strapped to a chair and just plonked in front of a screen and fed not quite enough food, you will walk much later than somebody who is, you know, gradually moved around and played with and physically entertained. You will develop your vocabulary according to the amount of social cues and the diversity of language and diversity of personalities that you're exposed to. So it's got a huge impact. There are some sort of curveballs. If you're a very sort of affluent middle class parent who has got the resources to be able to sort of carry your child around and put them in a pushchair and move them around the room and sort of play with them really interactively, your child may walk at about sort of 12 months, 14 months. If you literally plonk them on a playmat and then walk out the room and don't really interact with them very much, that child has oddly got to be a lot more independent and a lot more quickly if it wants to reach toys and so forth, if it's not having toys handed to it all the time. So perversely, children who are brought up without much interaction actually walk slightly earlier than other children, because they're forced to mobilise, they're forced to exercise. That's not a defence for doing it, it's a bad thing, but it's just one of the perverse things about inequality. I guess the big thing though is how nutrition and how social interaction really impact on development. So a well-nourished child will grow and develop much quicker than a slightly hungry child. And if you are stimulated with lots of play and lots of toys and lots of social interaction, you will develop communication styles that are more varied, quicker, and you'll have more confidence and more social confidence. So that is important. But if you then play a different sort of neglect game and don't talk about societal impacts, about, you know, what your family life is like, because some people's family lives, you know, through no fault of their own, they've been brought up in a family where mum is juggling 4 different jobs and struggling to put food on the table. Neglect is something that you can perpetrate by accident and despite goodwill. Take a child who's constantly in hospital, or a child with a heart condition, for example, who needs some surgery. They're going to be behind in their development as well. And if you trap a child not in a seat in front of the television, but if you trap them in a hospital bed, not able to leave their side room with a minimal amount of space, you get exactly the same problems. So actually, the things that we can do as individual doctors are to realise that when we hold our patients sort of in captivity for their own good, we are also creating damage developmentally. Now, it's damage that could be repaired. You know, kids will catch up. And if you're a month behind when you're 3 months old, that's a lot. But if you're a month behind when you're 13 years old, that's like nothing. Yeah. So, you know, they will catch up. But we've got to realise that we need to stimulate and entertain children in hospital, actually for the good of their development, because otherwise what we are creating in hospital is an environment very much akin to that of a neglected child. And we need to avoid doing that at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a bit more of a shift away from, I mean, it's still very much general peds, but it's a bit more centered to you. And, you know, in the research we made for that beautiful intro, we realized that you've had experience in numerous fields throughout your career, including general peds, neonatal care, and with complex syndromes, like you mentioned, Noonan syndrome.
Mhm.
Which area has interested you the most, if you're able to answer that? And why did you end up
No,
pursuing
don't
general?
make me pick.
And why did you end up pursuing general peds
Well,
rather than
do you know what?
specialising?
The inability to pick is I'm going to turn this around into an answer, right? Because that's part of the reason why I chose general peds, right? Is because of the variety. I mean, can you imagine spending ages learning the clotting cascade and the brachial plexus and the kidney, and then
Don't
not
even get me
using that
started.
information?
Yeah.
What a waste of like effort! How much of your degree is and stress is now rendered irrelevant?
Yeah.
So you know, it's certainly ergonomically and economically sensible to be a generalist, because you will actually use more of the knowledge that you've been told than in any other specialty. So yeah, I mean, I can't imagine anything worse than like just doing carpal tunnel syndrome surgery like 3 times a week or for 20 years. Like I don't want to do that. And there are some brains that, like, every time they do an operation, they're trying to hone their skill, they're trying to practice it, they're trying to get everything, they're trying to do it slightly neater than the last time, slightly better outcomes than the last time, they're trying to do it on a slightly more complicated wrist than the last time, and they love the intricacy and improvement and ownership of that. My first carpal tunnel operation was like fascinating to watch. The first one I assisted in was fascinating to watch and hold something, and then after that I was bored. I was like, I'm bored by the end of the list, you know. And I've put a couple of stitches in, but I'm just one of those brains that needs to be stimulated by variety. And so, you know, I'm always going to be more excited by a TV program like Taskmaster than I am by like a tennis match. Because you never know what's coming in a series of Taskmaster 1 minute to the next, whereas tennis match, like, one of them is going to hit the ball over that way, and then they're going to try and hit it back, and then it's sort of about how and sportsmanship and the soap opera over many years. But you know, I'm impatient, and my patients as a paediatrician get better a lot quicker than adult patients do, generally. So, but if I had to, I'm avoiding answering the question. If I had to pick one aspect of my career at the moment that I enjoy the most, I run a clinical service for Noonan syndrome, which I sort of fell into. One of the reasons why I fell into it is because there's a lot in the textbooks in the literature about how to identify it, and there's a lot in the textbooks in the literature about, you know, growth problems and heart problems. But actually, these children have got an awful lot of other problems that are not well researched in the literature because they're harder to measure. So they have really bad leg pains throughout their life. They have unpredictable clotting problems despite normal clotting results. They have significant feeding difficulties as babies that progresses often to bad vomiting, to oral aversion, and then to very fussy eating. And these general paediatric areas are very poorly understood, and they're very badly managed. And they're badly managed because most doctors have got sort of 1 or 2 cases of Noonan syndrome on their books, so they don't see it very often. Whereas I've got 200 on my books, so I can sort of see the patterns. And so the thing that I'm really enjoying is sort of being an advocate for this particular condition, but not from the point of view, as I was saying before, of like owning it and taking it all on myself and going, I'm the leg pain guy and I'm the vomiting guy. No, what I'm aiming to do is try to support their local doctors to be aware of the issues around this condition and manage that patient better.
Yeah.
And so to provide not only some care for the child in my clinic and in my service, but actually form those relationships with local doctors and hopefully improve outcomes for stuff that's harder to measure. Because improving someone's left ventricular function by giving them propranolol is important, because it means they're less likely to get to the point where they need valve surgery or a heart transplant or whatever. Cardiologists can do that. Giving them an extra few centimetres, which you can measure by whether they're growth hormone deficient and whether you need to give them growth hormone. The endocrinologists can do that. But measuring leg pain and measuring the degree of fussiness of eating and working out whether it's normal spectrum or not normal spectrum, that's a challenge, and that's what I'm doing, because most parents don't actually care what their child's left ventricular function is if they're able to run around a playground. And most parents don't really care that much whether currently their child is, slightly short in their class. But they do care about meal times taking 2 hours instead of 20 minutes. And they do care about their child waking up 5 times a night screaming in agony every day, every night. And doctors just not knowing what to do to make daily living easier. So that's the string to my bow that I would continue to play. Is it string to the bow as in violins, or is it string to the bow as in archery? I never know. I don't know with that metaphor, but whichever string to whatever bow it is, that's the one that I would either be drawing back or playing at the moment. But in 5 years' time, there will be another thing coming in that is a tempting answer to that. The final thing is, of course, don't take everything on yourself. So in 5 years' time, that Noonan syndrome clinic is not going to be Keir's Noonan syndrome clinic. It's going to be Keir and Anna's Noonan syndrome clinic, and it will be a shared service. And you can't just take stuff on yourself. So, there will be a new personal little project, but I'm not going to abandon the Noonans work.
Yeah, absolutely. We're also quite interested in your work in like perioperative care. And I think sometimes, this is, just from my perspective and experience, I think sometimes with the subspecialties, we already kind of isolate them. So cardiology's over there, renal's over there. But I think we tend to isolate kind of clinical medicine and surgery even more, because, there's that kind of battle between who wants to be a clinical physician and who wants to be a surgeon. And I thought it would be really interesting just to hear from your experience a little bit more about those experiences, how those conversations occur between patients, parents, alongside medical doctors and surgeons.
Okay, so we've got to pick out the difference between a surgeon and a medic, really, don't we, to begin with? So I guess one of the best lessons that I ever got in medicine was from a hand surgeon in Newcastle, who, when I was an F2, I think it was, he said, you've got to understand, kid, that a decent surgeon becomes very, very good at operating, but an excellent surgeon is really, really trying hard not to operate on people. The idea is to realise that surgery is the sort of the last resort, and that medical management is actually the gold standard. And that really threw me, because I thought that surgeons were sort of were focused on operations, because that's what surgical training does. You've got to collect a certain number. It's like Pokemon cards. You've got to sort of catch them all, haven't you? You've got to do a certain number of operations in order to get further up the tree. And I that was my experience of sort of surgical SHOs chasing operating time. But actually, the important thing is only to do the work that's safe. And you don't repair the cleft lip of a newborn baby. You wait until they're big enough to have a better outcome. You don't repair a cleft palate until they're 12 months old. You don't do it immediately, because it's easier surgery when they're bigger, and you're balancing an awful lot. So the first thing I will say about surgeons is that they are generally very, very thoughtful people about what they do. Very often the difficulty actually comes with the dialogue with parents, with saying, no, we're not going to operate yet, because the parents sort of often feel that an operation is the final goal, that is the solution. And if the solution is visible now, it should be done now. They have to juggle safety. And the reason why they have to juggle safety is that unlike with medics, right? If I give somebody ceftriaxone for their meningitis and they get better, ceftriaxone has made them better. I've written it on a piece of paper, but ceftriaxone's done the work. And if it's a resistant bug that ceftriaxone doesn't work on and they don't do well, that's not my fault. That's the fault of ceftriaxone. And I need to make sure that I identify that it's not working and make sure that I know how to interpret culture results and get them on some meropenem or whatever it is that might work instead. But every operation that a surgeon does that is a success is their work. They absolutely own the fact that hip joint is now moving. They absolutely own the fact that arm has been pinned correctly. They own that renal transplant that has given a child a new lease of life. But they have to own every single complication as well. They have to own every single stitch that has fallen out. They have to own every bleeding that has happened in surgery, and they have to own the catastrophic problems that happen when things go very unpredictably wrong. And I could never be a surgeon because I couldn't own that. I have a distance in medicine between myself and the clinical outcome to an extent. Now, there's all the clever thinking of, did I solve the puzzle and did I get the right medicine into the child at the right time? And yes, that's there. And of course, you can miss things like looking at a white count of 20 and thinking it's infection and not realizing it's leukemia, and there are exceptions to that general rule, but with every operation a surgeon has to own it all. Now, if they're going to own it all, they need to be really, really well supported, and they need to be really well supported by anesthesia and by perioperative medicine, because the people who are going to deal with mild complications either side are the perioperative medics and the anaesthetist, who are going to make sure that the child is in the safest position it's possible to be going into the operation, and that any minor things that happen after the operation, which can be relatively serious, are well managed, because you want a spinal surgeon to be excellent at fixating the spine, and you don't want them to be worried a day and a half later, really, about whether the secretions that are coming up from the chest of a child with cerebral palsy are just chest gunk because their lungs are now more open, or a pneumonia. Yeah? And then you do a CRP and it's 300 because they've had major spinal surgery. And so you need people to support you in the management of the post-operative phase. Because a team is much better than an individual. Don't take everything on yourself. It's like, this is a theme. If you silo everybody and you expect an orthopedic registrar doing their 6 months or 12 months of paediatrics to suddenly know how to interpret the chest secretions of a 13-year-old with cerebral palsy, you're mad. Yeah, you can't expect somebody to do that. Just like you can't throw me into A&E and expect me to manage adult chest pain, because the last time I managed adult chest pain was in 2009. I think I managed chest pain with Gaviscon, and I don't know whether the stuff that I learnt at medical school is really, really out of date. I could be placing leeches on them for all I know. as a management strategy. I could be doing the medical equivalent of that. So perioperative medicine is really, really important because it's not even the safety net. It's like part of the journey. The operation in the middle is the thing that you're trying to safety net either side. So when you have those awkward conversations with parents about complications, it's a team thing. I mean, yes, okay, if the wound's burst open, then there's a question of like, was it too tight to close? Has something gone wrong? But the management going forward is, where do we go from here? Is it infected? Let's work that out. Does it need a different sort of dressing? Let's work that out. So it is more collaborative. I guess the final thing that I will say is that I also do perioperative medicine in some resource-deprived communities. So every year I do a charity outreach project in South America where I'm the perioperative paediatrician for some cleft palate repairs in Ecuador or Peru. And there, it very often is just you and the surgeons, but you do muck together, and the anaesthetist and the medic and the surgeon form an important alliance. So even when you're really strapped for resources, these charities don't want a surgeon to be managing everything. Yeah. They get a paediatrician in to manage them before and after. They get, and obviously an anaesthetist, needs an anaesthetist, but it's still the same trio.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all teamwork at the end of the day, and sharing responsibility and sharing resources.
It's interesting. I've never really I've gone through my surgical rotations last year, and I've never really thought about how that kind of like responsibility of the surgeon is quite, as you were saying, like if it goes wrong, it's entirely their fault. But not entirely their fault, but you just kind of highlighted the point of how, collaboration, teamwork is so important in all of this kind of stuff, to like kind of share the responsibility, but also kind of support each other into making sure that the outcome for the patient is the best, which is a great point to have. And so now to close our little podcast, so it's finally on our last question, and something that I think you were quite passionate talking about earlier. Something that we really loved coming across, and you've been talking about as well, was the fact that you said that you really wanted to be an actor, and you're very that you really love the arts, and you're an advocate for the arts. And me and Yameena are also advocates of the arts. We have our own interests as well, and we were just wondering how you've managed to balance that when you were a medical student, even through the exam seasons, the stressful exam seasons, and all of the new things that are just quite overwhelming and everything. How did you manage to keep that with you? And also, even now as a general pediatrician, how have you been able to still keep that as well?
Yeah, I'm going to give what's going to sound like a flippant answer, but is actually a serious one. Okay, and that is that I've probably learned more about how to be a good doctor from acting than I have from medical school. And I'm having to concentrate on like looking serious when I say this, because if I say it too enthusiastically, it sounds quite sort of campanati. One of the things that you have to do when you're working in medicine is you have to gain the trust of the person that you're talking to, and that's a challenge when it's a 4-year-old, because I am 11 times their age. Okay, I don't look like them. I'm a stranger, and yes, I can get the trust of a parent relatively easily by talking to them sensibly and sternly about science, but then I don't have the trust of the 4-year-old. If, however, I can behave like a 4-year-old with a 4-year-old and gain the trust of a 4-year-old, I get the parents' trust because I look like someone who's actually met a child before and can talk to them and know what's going on. So that ability to sort of slightly change personality is important. If you have just spent 45 minutes in resus dealing with a complex seizure, and then you come out of resus and have to deal with your next A&E patient who's got an ingrown toenail, the one thing that you can't do is let that previous experience colour your next experience, because that person's in pain and they've come to hospital, and you can't be flippant with them. You can't go, well, you don't know what I was dealing with next door, for goodness sake. You've got to go, God, that looks like it's sore and we need to sort that out. Let's work out what we can do. We may not be able to do something here, but we'll see what we can. That demands, and I'm going to be really quite politically incorrect here, that demands a degree of insincerity. It requires, when we talk about empathy, what we actually mean is conveying emotions and experiencing emotions. And sometimes that actually needs to be done insincerely. Sometimes your brain may be thinking, I actually don't care about this. But your mouth and your face have to say, I do care about this. And you don't actually have to care about it. You have to behave as if you care about it. Yeah? And everything in your behaviour has to suggest that you do care about it. And you have to sort the problem out. And you have to seem as though you absolutely care about that ingrowing toenail. Yeah? Even if you don't. And that is acting, because acting is the borderline of sincerity and insincerity. It's saying something that Keir Shiels doesn't really think, because Keir Shiels is not actually king of the fairies, but he has to do Oberon's speech as if he is. Yeah? And he has to say it sincerely. And so, and you know, when you have got your 85th baby with bronchiolitis, you will have a sort of patter. You'll have a script that you end up saying. You cannot say it as if it's the 85th time you've delivered that information. You have to deliver it as if it is organic, on the spur of the moment, meaningful to that particular child and that particular patient. You can't sort of roll your eyes and go, well, the thing about the lungs is that they... You've got to mean it in that moment, even if you don't mean it. And so acting has been with me all the way through medicine, and it's a skill that is essential in order to be able to deliver difficult news, that you can sort of prep it, you can emote it, you can be in control of it. So that's there all the time. And you also, with an interest in the arts, if you watch a lot of theatre, watch a lot of film, you get to experience people behaving in certain ways in situations that you've never been in yourself, or from backgrounds that you've never met yourself. That's the joy of the arts. The joy of the arts is when you open a book of poetry or a novel or something, and there is somebody completely fictional on a page feeling exactly like you did about something.
Yeah.
Like you could never articulate it, but it's there in black and white, and some other distant human has imagined a thing that you've got a shared experience of. And when you come across, 14-year-olds involved in gang violence, when you come across, the child of a sex worker with HIV, who is a really doting, loving parent of their child, when you come across these moments of the real world for the first time, of which you have no experience at all, because you grew up in a lovely 1920s house in a suburb of Newcastle, right? Suddenly, the arts actually helps you imagine what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes, or gives you exposure to lives that you have never lived and that you've never had access to. So true empathy actually comes from being able to imagine and put yourself in the shoes of people that you would have no experience of dealing with at all, and trying to work out how to communicate with them in a way that doesn't make you sound like a posh, pompous, white, middle-class man, but in a way where there is a degree of equal exchange and understanding. So that's the importance of the art. It is humanity, and it does teach you what other people think like. It does teach you, and it doesn't matter whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's Bluey, right? There's something in a story that is very powerful, and that if a story is listened to and held and understood, gives you the tools to deal with other patients, because we are, as doctors, in the business of listening to people's stories. That's first and foremost what medical history is. We take a story and then we work with that story and edit that story to come up with something practical and go, ceftriaxone. But we are storymongers. So, we are story wrights. We work with stories. We don't craft stories, but we work with it as a material. And unless you have got some sort of grounding in the arts or culture, you will never be an insightful clinician. You may be great, with pathology or radiology. I'm not meaning to be rude about other disciplines, but there are some disciplines where the story is less important, or the interactive skills are less important.
Yeah.
And there are others like psychiatry where it's like everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's essential. I think it's absolutely essential to be good at your job. And also, if you've done a real run of like a touring production of a theatre company, you know what it's like to be really, really sleep deprived. So it makes night shift an awful lot easier.
Yeah. Oh, on that amazing note, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode. This was such a thought-provoking conversation, a really productive one. So huge thanks again to Dr. Keir Shiels for sharing your insight, experience, and passion for supporting young people.
That's all right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keir Shiels.
That's great. I've had an absolute ball, and
Great.
I love just being able to witter on about whatever I fancy. So thank you for facilitating.
I really enjoyed our conversation as well.
Absolutely. So many takeaways.
I'm going to be naughty. I'm going to be naughty.
Yeah.
I'm just going to ask you a question, which is what would you as 20-year-olds, my God, medical students, what would you teach me? What do I need to know? Right? Because this is not a one-way thing, right? What do you think that we need to understand about medical students and what their needs are? What are we getting wrong, or what are we getting right?
Do you want to go first? Because I'm still thinking.
It's hard being put on the spot, isn't it?
Mm.
Such a good question. I've got so much.
This isn't going to make the edit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've got something.
Okay.
If you want me to go first. I think for me, I mean, I'm very much at the beginning of the whole journey. And I think that, I mean, I didn't go through the graduate entry route, so I kind of entered medicine, straight, fresh out of school. And I think what could be better understood about medical students is that many of us are still in that period of life where we're doing, a bit of soul searching. And I think medicine is such an amazing field to be you're kind of like searching for yourself in a sense, because it's so broad and you're learning so much about the human body and its extremes in so many kind of regards. But I think the most important thing is, I think we have improved, and I think that in conversation with some of my other medical student friends, we are focusing a lot more on the doctor and the importance of just as we care for patients, how we care for our colleagues and our peers. But I think it is just kind of understanding that medical students also have the space to learn about themselves and kind of grow. And one thing I really struggled with was like you mentioned the coagulation cascade earlier. And I was like, oh my God, absolutely not. And I think it is, understanding that, yes, I might have to learn something right now, but that's not me not knowing the coagulation cascade right now isn't at any immediate detriment to anyone. Giving myself the space to learn and to grow and to find myself
remember it, you can look it up.
Finding it. Exactly.
You can look it up in the real world. In the real world, you are allowed to look it up.
Yeah, and I think it is a beautiful thing, just giving ourselves the space to grow as people alongside growing as physicians. I think that's the main thing. I hope
if you want a tip about how to learn the coagulation cascade, right, draw it out, but instead of putting numbers on the page, put faces of people who have got some sort of associated number. So I've done it with the actors who played Doctor Who, for example, right? And so great. Doctor number 1, Doctor number 2, and I can remember where John Pertwee is on the picture, and I can remember where Christopher Eccleston is on the picture, and I can remember where Matt Smith is, and because the human brain is much better at remembering faces, right? Now, you may have it with a football team, you may have it with the people who've been Bond villains in the Bond films that you can remember in order, or whatever it is. But if you replace the numbers with faces, you will suddenly remember that 3 and 7 go together, and that 5 and 10 go together, and you'll just remember the geography of it an awful lot better. Yeah. So I think we need to do it with footballers or Doctors Who.
I think we need to do another episode where you just give us study tips at this point. This is good. That was a great one.
Yeah, I mean,
what about you, Laetisha?
The thing is, when you come to do your finals, what you'll realise is that you spend more time agonising when you're revising about what you're not revising at that moment. So you'll like have respiratory in front of you, and you'll be petrified that you're not revising haematology or endocrine, and so you'll be like, shit, I'm not revising respiratory. But when you're revising, you'll suddenly realise that it's like putting together a jigsaw without the box, without the picture of what you're putting together. And you find little bits that go together and other little bits that go together. And then you sort of realise what you go. And then there's this moment about a week and a half before finals where you just suddenly go, shit, it's a ship. Oh, that goes up there. And then that's a cloud. And that's up there. And then that actually is steam from the thing. And then that goes onto there. And that links into that bit. And whoa, that's connected to there. And suddenly, somehow, everything suddenly clicks. But it won't happen for ages. So just enjoy learning it organically at the time and keep dipping into it, because you've got to enjoy it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think for me, I really do agree with Yameena's point, to be honest. Like, even myself right now, I'm still trying to figure out my own stuff. And once you go into clinical years as well, it's when you start realizing, what kind of doctor am I? How do I communicate with patients? What kind do I not want to be, that really nice, friendly, chatty one, or that calm one? I'm still thinking about all of those kinds of things. But not to steal your point. So
But you've got to work out not just what sort of doctor you want to be, but also what sort of doctor you are, and therefore what suits you best. So there's this old adage, isn't there, that like
Definitely.
all neurosurgeons are a bit psychopathic, right? But actually, if you think about it, if you've got a brain in front of you with a tumour in it, and you are going to remove that tumour, you better not be panicking at that moment about what damage you could be causing. Like you do not want empathy at that moment. You want absolute clinical judgment about where tumour stops and where brain starts, because you've got to decide whether, on balance, you would like to make the mistake of leaving some tumour in, or the mistake of cutting out some good brain. Like, that's not something I want to deal with at all. Okay?
Absolutely.
So you need to kind of be able to divorce yourself slightly from the potential impacts of what's going on in order to be able to do it. So you need people who are neurosurgeons to at least have that switch. Now, you don't want that switch to be off all the time, obviously. But if you're the sort of person who will always overthink what the course of action that you're taking, what it might do, you don't want to go into neurosurgery, regardless of how much you enjoy neuroanatomy. You've got to be the right person for the specialty, as well as being able to mould yourself a bit. Because, as I said at the beginning, if you're naturally a really gregarious person, you're not going to be able to will yourself into introversion. Yeah,
absolutely.
And so you've got to work. It's a marriage. The specialty and the personality. You've got to find something that you're suitable for. And if you're impatient and don't like 8.5 hour long operations in which you're peeling back layers of things in microsurgery, like, nobody is going to tell you to be more patient so that you take that advice and just become more patient. That's not the way the world works. Never in the history of calming down has anybody ever calmed down by being told to calm down. You've just got to find your niche.
Yeah, I agree, because I think, especially us medics, from a young age, most of us have been kind of good at everything, and very good at multiple different disciplines. So I think sometimes when it comes to making that decision, it's the hardest thing. But understanding that the person you are is going to kind of develop and be part of that decision, it's a huge kind of thing as well.
Yeah, and people have been not necessarily good at everything, but good at enough to assume that they're good at everything.
Yes.
They're like, I'm good at biology and chemistry and math. I could be good at history. I'm not doing history, but I guess I could turn my attention to it. And so the thing about then entering medical school is you've got this wealth of possibilities in front of you with stuff that you'd never thought of, like ear, nose and throat surgery or chemical pathology, right? And everybody just assumes that they could turn their hand to everything. And actually, you can't. You've got to find the thing that speaks to you the most, because when you find the thing that speaks to you the most, it becomes less effort And when you have to apply the effort, there's more willingness to apply more effort. So yeah, find your niche and don't take on too much yourself. Those are my learning points. As an educationalist, I'm supposed to leave with bullet pointed learning points, aren't I?
Those are the objectives, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, that's a perfect way just to kind of end there. So if you're a medical student interested in general pediatrics or anything that we've really discussed today, or you want to be better at supporting your younger patients, we hope this episode gave you some food for thought. I'd be surprised if you didn't have any food for thought there. And we'd love to hear your thoughts via Spotify
indigestion
or
of
Instagram.
thought.
And if you liked what you heard, make sure you're following at teddytalks.peds on Instagram for updates on when episodes will be released. Rate this episode on Spotify and share.
Thanks for listening to Teddy Talks, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.